I'm Josh Hammer.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now all over the place, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So welcome back, everybody. We have a fun show today. We're covering all kinds of things, kind of a grab bag of everything going on in the world. So we're going to start with Ben actually talking about doctors deputizing the DOJ to transition their kids, because that's always a great topic and something wonderful to discuss. I'm going to talk about the perennial classic of how we learn nothing, this time the COVID-19 edition. Emily's going to talk about Me Too turning 5, and we're going to round it out with Josh talking about our strategy toward Ukraine. Hopefully we can get through this episode without anyone firing nuclear weapons. That will be the goal. So with that, we'll turn it over to Ben.
Well, what we have here is yet another effort to follow the playbook of the National School Board Association, as everyone recalls, sicking the DOJ or attempting to sick the DOJ, the FBI, and other authorities on those who would dare question, in that case, draconian COVID regulations or indoctrination in racial Marxism, that is critical race theory in schools. Here you have the doctors following this playbook, particularly the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the Children's Hospital Association, which are now going on the offensive, seeking to collude with the DOJ to suppress, stifle, and chill those who would dare question, quote unquote, gender affirming care. So they wrote this letter to the DOJ, a public letter, and they call for essentially here, they claim that there are these attacks rooted in an international campaign of disinformation, where a few high-profile users on social media share false and misleading information targeting individuals, physicians, and hospitals, resulting in a rapid escalation of threats, harassment, and disruption of care across multiple jurisdictions. To my knowledge, they don't actually cite any substantial list of purported attacks on hospitals, doctors, et cetera. Obviously, attacks which we would abhor if they existed. They cite one bomb threat, for example, in this letter. But it, again, seems to follow the exact template of the National School Board Association letter, where when you drill down into the list of cases that they cited as representing threats to school boards, actually fell apart under examination. So what are they calling on the DOJ to do, on top of calling for social media platforms like TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, to clamp down on misinformation, which they do in their letter? They call for Merrick Garland to, quote, investigate the organizations, individuals, and entities coordinating, provoking, and carrying out bomb threats and threats of personal violence against children's hospitals and physicians across the U.S. So this, of course, comes in the wake of massive blowback against the idea that doctors ought to try to transition children, particularly in the wake of, for example, Matt Walsh's expose of the goings-on at Vanderbilt University, which really exposed that this is a massive money-making operation on top of all of the other abhorrent aspects of promoting childhood transition, which are now going on at schools as well, and of course with the help of doctors here. This also comes amid libs of TikTok, that account being stifled I don't know how many times and kicked off Twitter for holding up a window to this very kind of gender identity insanity. So basically what you see here is another ideological and also material racket that is under threat. And here you have the organized medical establishment going on the offensive and seeking not just regulation, but actually deputizing the DOJ to protect that racket, while also, of course, calling for chilling free speech on social media as well. And this follows, of course, in an effort to combat climate misinformation, so-called election misinformation. And then, of course, there was the medical misinformation racket around COVID-19 as well. And by the way, that, of course, has manifested itself in a number of disturbing ways, including this AB 2098 bill in California, which was signed into law, which would allow state medical boards to punish physicians who spread, quote unquote, disinformation or misinformation regarding COVID-19 and its treatment options. In fact, leading medical schools like the University of Chicago are actually now out offering classes on combating medical misinformation. So I think you're going to see this play out in every single sphere of power, but it's particularly disturbing, as we've talked about before, when it comes to medicine and science, not the science, but actual science, when you have this assault on dissenting views. And there's a great thread that Chris Rufo put together on it. I'll just quote a little bit from it briefly, and then we can jump into a conversation on it. But he goes, "This is now the left's playbook. Last year, National School Board Association, DOJ, FBI worked together to label parents who oppose CRT domestic terrorists. They want to stifle dissent, suppress speech, and criminalize opposition." And he goes, "The morality of the situation is blindingly clear. Threatening hospitals is wrong. Censoring journalists is wrong. Criminalizing political opposition is wrong. Surgically removing a child's genitalia is wrong." I think that's probably a winning issue. That's probably like an 80% plus winning issue among the American people. If Republicans, for example, would recognize that, that would be something. And he says, if gender affirming care is so good, and this is a critical point, the activists and doctors who promote it and profit from it should defend their practices in the realm of public opinion. In a democracy, everyone gets to weigh in on important issues, not just regime-approved apparatchiks. So I think this is a really important space to watch. The corruption of the sciences and medicine in particular, in terms of both the wokeism, like racially rationing COVID treatment, for example, as well as the silencing of dissenting views, is literally going to get people killed. And it's undermining further our First Amendment while we have government authorities potentially colluding here with outside groups. So I think, kind of to open up the conversation, I think this reflects there's nothing the regime won't do when it comes to stifling and suppressing dissent on any issue that would dare threaten its power. But one positive aspect of this is that I think the backlash against gender affirming care that's resulted in this counteroffensive speaks to the power of activists outside the political system to actually move mountains here. Again, Republicans are MIA. Where are they? I don't know. Maybe you all have some ideas about that. But thank God for those on the outside who are actually exposing this terrible racket with devastating societal consequences.
I think there's a Democrat in Kansas that's flip-flopping on this right now, on women's sports right now. But the quick thought that I have after everything Ben laid out is simply that this is why, if you think back on Michael Anton's Flight 93 election, the cockpit is so important in the sort of post-Wilsonian age of 2022, when you're talking about the DOJ being, the levers of the DOJ being able to be pulled in ways that have such dramatic effects for every single small town corner of this country. It's mind-boggling and terrifying, and it's what the left doesn't understand about conservative politics going forward. They're freaking out about Herschel Walker allegedly paying his mistress to have an abortion back in 2009 this week. And it reminded me a lot, actually, kind of what happened when Alabama voters said that they were going to vote for Roy Moore despite all of the allegations against him because Doug Jones supported abortion. I mean, this is like getting to the point where the president of the United States is in charge of a vast personnel that has an incredible effect at the flick of a pen on the culture, the health, because of the way we define these words now, of the entire country. It's maddening and insane that this comes down to the DOJ, and that the DOJ is in a position to have power like this, just like the education department had under President Obama. And I think it's just very telling that this is where conservative politics is going, because if you want to prevent things like this from happening, imperfect populist candidates are going to be a lot more appealing no matter what the left says.
Go ahead, Rachel. Okay, no, I was gonna say I'm not really sure how much I have to add, Ben. That was a very helpful kind of laying out of what is going on here. I mean, to me, this story I think is best viewed as at kind of like a macro higher level. I guess it's just another data point and kind of the roiling realization, if you will, by many on the right, that kind of coming to terms with the fact that the Department of Justice is just no longer a friend. I mean, like, it arguably at this point is potentially not even salvageable. I mean, this is kind of the crux, I think, of Julie Kelly's recent talk at NatCon 3. Obviously the federal government needs a law enforcement apparatus. So, I mean, it's not like we're going to just completely do away with it, but, serious reforms have to be made. I mean, and the other thing, obviously, is that this can only be viewed as kind of just another kind of string of the DOJ just directly getting involved in the culture war. I mean, hold aside just kind of like the Carter Page, Trump, Russiagate stuff. Like, hold all of that aside for a moment. It's very hard to do, obviously. The DOJ is kind of at the epicenter of that entire imbroglio. But even just focusing on the bread and butter kind of civilizational culture war issues, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, it was just about a year ago, honestly. It was early October 2021, obviously, when Merrick Garland went to war against parents revolting against critical race theory, racist indoctrination all across the country. So, to me, stories like this really just have to be viewed in unison like that. And, once again, to kind of go back to, one of the many recurring leitmotifs in this podcast, the left has no compunctions whatsoever about its view and its use of the federal and indeed the state and local law enforcement apparatuses in this country as a tool to reward their friends and punish their enemies. And I'm still waiting for someone on the right to kind of come to terms with the fact that some level of kind of tit for tat reciprocity is what we have to do the next time that we wield any kind of meaningful degree of power.
Yeah, I think, this whole episode goes to show how interconnected all of these things are, because it's one thing for the American Medical Association to have these ridiculous views on gender transition, but it's completely another for them to say it out loud, demand that discussion be banned on social media, and expect it to happen. And they know that it will. And so I think this is kind of what we're dealing with. And I would also point out, I think Ben alluded to it when you were talking about the California law, that I don't know if this is the first time this has ever happened, but you have a state saying it will not enforce custody agreements of another state if the issue is around gender transition. That is just an unconscionable precedent that we're setting here. So it's not just that, no, you can't discuss these things in public. It's that you cannot have any independent choice about how you raise your child, and states are going to enforce against other states in managing that. So we are, I think, definitely sort of tipping over into like a dystopian universe in many ways. I hate, we overuse the term, but I think this is kind of where we are. But I think on the topic of this sort of elite control and of society, of the culture, of no one ever being punished for anything that happens, I think my topic segues very clearly into this with the news that EcoHealth Alliance, which I know we've discussed EcoHealth Alliance and the role of Peter Daszak on this podcast before, but EcoHealth Alliance was the organization that received money from the NIH that funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars from various U.S. government grants to the now infamous Wuhan Institute of Virology, which many consider, and I think it's incredibly considered at this point, to be the source of the COVID-19 pandemic. They were working very specifically on how viruses transmit from animals to humans, gain of function research, so capably called out a number of times in the Senate by Senator Rand Paul. And, of all the oversight that's been done, right? You've had oversight in the Senate and in the House. You've had numerous media reporting on the role of Daszak and the EcoHealth Alliance and gain of function research to the extent that it's fairly common knowledge right now. Well, it was announced yesterday that he is now getting another $600,000 grant by Anthony Fauci's agency. And it's just, there's a million different ways that we could talk about this story. But the first thing that occurred to me when I saw this news, and the reason I wanted to bring it up, is because I'm constantly asked on, panels and interviews and whatever, why is populism surging, right? Why is populism surging across the West? Well, this is why. Okay, when it's so blatant that these people screwed up to a just titanic degree, to a global degree, chapter in verse, how COVID not only killed people, but set kids years behind in schooling, raised the rate of alcoholism in the United States. It's just systemic societal change from this COVID-19 pandemic. We know one of the sources of this was Peter Daszak, EcoHealth Alliance, Anthony Fauci's mismanagement of NIAID, or intentional, management of it in this way. And yet we're rewarding this person. Instead of punishing them, they are being rewarded. And this is why populism, one of the reasons, right, that as a meta narrative, populism is surging across the West, because again and again and again, elites lead this country into chaos, and they are not punished for it. They are rewarded for it. There's a oft used quote in DC that I won't use the profane version of it, but it's something to the extent of excrement flows uphill. And that is exactly what we're dealing with, but on a societal level. So if you want to know why people are just fed up and sick of it and willing to elect candidates like Donald Trump and Herschel Walker and anyone they think is going to walk in and kick the beehive and not care, this is why, because the hive itself is so dysfunctional and so rotten to the core. So after that rant, I'll open it up.
Nobody was moved by Rachel.
I sucked all the rage out of the panel.
No, I think really what just happened is that you said it all. It's stunning, and that's really, I mean, from my perspective, I don't understand. Like, it seems wrong to me that this is, even for all of the crazy things that happen in this country, that happen in American politics, and that have especially happened in the last, half decade. This seems impossible. It's an impossible level of arrogance, but it actually makes complete sense when you think about it, because Anthony Fauci, Peter Daszak, in the past couple of years, what they have demonstrated is a complete lack of shame. Like Fauci, he's misleading, but then he's not even like concerned about, he'll talk to the New York Times about it, right? Like he's fine. When he was misleading about masks, what was it, like a year later, he's happy to tell the New York Times that's exactly what he did. And it just speaks to the shameless superiority complex that our unelected bureaucrats have. And this is the exact same thing basically we just talked about with the DOJ and Ben's segment, that we have this vast government of unelected bureaucrats who stay in these positions for their entire careers, wield incredible power that nobody ever checks. And that's exactly how they think that it should be. It is exactly how they think the country should be governed. And so that's the best reaction I can muster to this story, which again, it seems impossible, but I guess it makes perfect sense.
One thing that people talked about for a little while, this is like a talking point that some were talking about, and when it comes to COVID, the new Steve Deace, Dan Horowitz book, I think they provocatively titled it "The Fourth Reich" or something like that. If I'm remembering the title and the book cover correctly, kind of draped in that red hue that we all kind of became accustomed to when we saw the senile, doddering dolt from Delaware give his red drenched speech in Philadelphia about a month and a half ago or so. Anyway, in the new Deace Horowitz book, they call for kind of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I think back to this essay that Liel Leibovitz wrote at Tableau magazine. I'm trying to remember when Liel wrote that piece. I don't know, maybe it was within the past year or so, maybe like 8 to 10 months ago or something like that. And he basically, if I'm remembering the title correctly, he said, if you're wrong, you have to apologize. Because sometimes when there's just like a glaring mess up, an apology is actually like a very good thing. Like you seek to atone for your sins. I mean, as the case may be, we're actually recording this, a mere number of hours away from Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year, which is the Jewish Day of Atonement. So maybe it's kind of top of mind for me, I guess, but it seems to kind of like play quite well here. I mean, Anthony Fauci, Deborah Birx, and kind of the entirety of what Ron DeSantis calls the biomedical security state, they should atone for their sins. They should atone for the fact that they wrecked lives, that they literally destroyed human beings' lives for multiple years. And lest you think that I'm being hyperbolic here, I work from home for better for us. So, my life was comparatively destroyed, considerably less than others. Not so much the people who had to close their jobs, the small business owners, not so much the children who missed out on years of elementary school education, of socializing with their classmates, of kind of playing t-ball with their kids on the baseball field, like basic kind of life growing up experiences. I'm thankful that I went through this COVID BS in my early 30s and not when I was a kid. Who knows how we all would have ended up, obviously. And we're not going to know how these children who went through this ended up for a while. So, I think that one of the better ways to ultimately go through this is from some sort of kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission style system. I'm not particularly optimistic that we're going to get it. I think to put it mildly, but if there's one thing that I would like to see from our purported elders and our purported people who deign to us and know better in the ruling class, it would be kind of just any attempt at kind of an admission of guilt or an atonement for the way that they have just wrecked countless lives and really just destroyed large swaths of this country and this great civilization over the past few years.
So I would say the reason that there will be no atonement here, or the indication is that there will be no atonement, is that they deem their efforts to be a success. They're not grading themselves clearly on the same metrics we would. And there's been nothing to indicate to them that they did fail and that they ought to atone and that there actually ought to be real culpability for it. The money continues to flow to these agencies. Zero heads rolled. Besides a few exchanges with a Rand Paul here or there, that's about it in the way of public confrontation with these individuals and scrutiny. So why would we expect anything but for them to continue to dole out grants like these, for the very most culpable parties to continue to be rewarded when there's been no punishment for it, no penalty for it? It's the same thing. We can look at analogous efforts across the entire regime, across the administrative state, certainly when it comes to the FBI and the DOJ and a whole slew of other agencies as well. Failure, as we see it, they view as a success if it means protecting themselves and growing their power. And I think one way to just think about this entire theme is that from start to finish, and I guess maybe it's probably not finished yet because who knows what'll come in the future, but the coronavirus, the response to the coronavirus, its creation, every single layer of it is a case study in the regime. They were funding something risky and dangerous that they shouldn't have been, and there was supposed to be a moratorium on it. They were doing so colluding with our worst adversary, Communist China. The consequences of it led to, for them, a massive increase in their power and authority and usurpation of our rights, trotting upon our rights, destroying liberty and justice in a million different ways, exploiting a crisis in whole or in part of their own creation. There's been no oversight or accountability about it. They've covered up every single aspect of it, no punishment, and now you have a reward at the end of it. So I think this is a perfect case study in how the regime operates. And again, as we go back to, until and unless there is real justice with real teeth for the worst actors, it just guarantees infinitely worse to come. And any Republican worth their salt, any politician worth their salt, has to be able to articulate that they understand this and that they plan on doing something about it, or they don't deserve anyone's vote. And I think that ought to be, it's a very simple standard. Do you get it or not? And if you don't get it and you don't plan on having any kind of response to it, then you should not be a representative in this country.
Well, everyone, time flies when you're having fun. And I regret to inform you, it has been 5 long years since the Me Too movement kicked off in early October of 2017. So all time seems to blend together now that we've had more than 2 years of a pandemic. But at the same time, I was actually pretty shocked to think back and realize it had been 5 years of the Me Too movement. And since that, I think everyone here remembers what it was like for the first year of the Me Too movement, and let alone the first 6 months. Remember, this kicked off with a New York Times report on Harvey Weinstein that was also, importantly, a story about how the press had been controlled, manipulated, and bought off by Weinstein for years. And that's where, the movement started to really get traction, is because it started as something that had actually populist appeal. You could say mass populist appeal. This was something that tapped into bipartisan frustrations. And then after about 6 months, careened into this weird, juggernaut, self-perpetuating juggernaut, where the snowball was just rolling down the hill and becoming so big that it was crushing people like Aziz Ansari, who had behaved, let's say, ungentlemanly on a date and was then publicly accused of sexual assault for his ungentlemanly behavior. This was fertile ground for both the left and the right. For the left to say the patriarchy had not yet been sufficiently undercut, and for the right to say, there's something of a matriarchy that is causing some of these problems, and truly traditional norms would have prevented, or maybe a healthy recognition of traditional norms would have prevented this from ever becoming so painful for so many women. And here we are 5 years later. Johnny Depp beat Amber Heard, as the New York Times, I shouldn't say beat in this context, legally beat Amber Heard in the defamation lawsuit, which was huge news this summer, and a lot of people said it was the death knell for the Me Too movement. But the New York Times, in this sort of long retrospective, is ultimately ambivalent on the the movement its reporting on Weinstein helped kick off. Ambivalent because, you know, for a lot of feminist reasons, it quotes a lot of sort of hardcore feminists who are still lamenting the power of the patriarchy. And at the same time, I think what the movement became is where a lot of this ambivalence is rooted in. We have a spate of books that have hit shelves in the last year from people who are center-left feminists, Louise Perry, Christine Emba, even Bridget Fetisi recently wrote a piece called I Regret Being a Slut. BuzzFeed had that piece that was called Gen Z is Rethinking Sex Positivity just about a year ago. I've mentioned it here many times because I really thought it was groundbreaking. And this is coming on the heels of Me Too. You have young women who are themselves saying the norms of the sexual revolution that, you know, really led to a lot of the Me Too problems are not healthy in and of themselves, and not just because of the Me Too issues, but because of other ones. So I'll kick it over to the group. When we look back on the last 5 years, and especially those first couple of years of the Me Too movement, those first 6 months where it's like crazy and your head was spinning every single day to see what institution of some particular industry was about to be taken down. It seemed like it was also just this huge explosion of cancel culture and how these digital technologies can fuel cancel culture and ruin lives, whether they're celebrities or regular people. So when you guys look back and realize that we're 5 years after that Weinstein story just broke everything wide open, what's your evaluation of the Me Too movement?
I mean, I think ultimately, you know, your summation is correct in the sense that I think it did bring to light some new perspectives. It brought to light a lot of these issues that had lived underground for a really long time. But ultimately, it was a movement that sort of ate itself, right? It made itself not credible because it just kept using the mob, right, to go after people for just not credible allegations. And you know, when you use the mob to go after someone and then the bottom of the argument falls out when it comes out that, you know, it was you know, misunderstanding, or it was something not nearly reaching the level of sexual assault, you dilute the issue of sexual assault, and also you undermine your own credibility. And I think that's a lot of what happened there. Not to say that some good things, you know, didn't come out of it, but I do think it has kicked off, Emily, to your point, this broader conversation around the consequences of the sexual revolution and kind of how women want to see themselves in society. And I think that's interesting to watch, and it's good. I think it's taking place, I think, at a slightly younger level than the elder millennial set that I reside in. It's more Gen Z sort of rethinking these things. But they're coming to grips, I think, with what the left has parroted for a long time about what women should want and how women should feel about certain things and what empowerment really means. And I'm very interested to see how the pendulum has swung so far. It's beginning to swing back in the other direction. And that's, I don't know that it has the cultural hold that the Me Too movement did at the upper levels, but I do see it gurgling up from sort of the bottom and then younger Gen Z. So I think that's pretty interesting. I want to hear the men talk about
Josh, you want to go first? Or
Yes. I mean, look, I guess when I think about Me Too, you know, this reaches its culmination in 2017. I can like remember it vividly because this is actually kind of the stint that I did at the law firm when I was at Kirkland Ellis. This kind of overlap of my 16, 17 months or however long my particularly glorious stint was at the in big law. And, you know, obviously being in like a very like corporate, a big law setting, I mean, you know, like we felt Me Too, obviously. I mean, not so much, you know, by like the day-to-day activities, but in kind of like the corporate missives and the emails and the various training and the modules and all the online things that we had to kind of attend and do. So I kind of remembered very well. And, you know, I guess this was also around the time when there was a special election in Alabama with Roy Moore, obviously, and the groping. So I kind of have these like very vivid images in my mind. It kind of feels like a long time ago. It almost, I don't want to say it feels like a half a lifetime ago. That would be overstating it. But so much has happened in the world since then. I mean, I guess the Me Too movement kind of went for it all. It kind of threw its Hail Mary pass in the Brett Kavanaugh nomination, right? I mean, that was kind of the Me Too movement trying to operationalize itself and take itself to the next level and kind of go down as kind of like a Martin Luther King-esque civil rights struggle. And it failed. It demonstrably and clearly failed. Brett Kavanaugh's on the Supreme Court. No one ended up particularly buying the Christine Blasey Ford. that itself is like another day that is just like totally etched in my memory. Just said, it's like a personal aside. I mean, that was September 2018. So that was the next year after I was in Big Law. I was clerking for Judge Ho on the Fifth Circuit, and I remember being glued to my television. And I don't know if y'all remember, like that morning after Christine Blasey Ford's testimony, I was looking around to my clerks and like my friends texting, whatever. I was like, oh my God, like Kavanaugh's dumb. Like they're going to have to pull the nom. And then he came out there that afternoon and, he did like the revenge for the Clintons thing. Kavanaugh's been like an okay justice since then, nothing to write home about. But the Me Too movement failed. I mean, to me, that was clearly its overstepping. Like that particular day kind of sealed its fate. The only other thing to note is Black Lives Matter and kind of the broader kind of critical race theory, equity, Ibram X. Kendi paradigm so easily kind of filled the niche, so easily kind of swooped in and kind of filled the void left by the fact that the Me Too movement so overstepped and failed. So I think it might be worth pondering for kind of cultural critics, sociologists, maybe people who specialize in this perhaps a little more than I do. Maybe the Emily Jashinskys of the world, I don't know, can like think a little harder as to like why exactly it is that BLM seems to have had kind of a longer kind of shelf life than Me Too. Not entirely sure why that is, but it's something to at least think about.
Nobody likes women.
The obvious takeaway.
How do I follow up that comment? So I think the way that I sort of view this at a high level is that to the extent that this movement brought creeps, horrible human beings to justice, that is an unalloyed good, no question about it. But it was inevitable that the attempt to politically exploit it would lead to a massive overreach that would have ultimately dire consequences. And we can weigh net on net the costs and benefits of the movement, narrowly or broadly, depending on how we want to think about them. But to Josh's point, I think that the apex of this was the attempt to destroy Brett Kavanaugh. And in some sense, that also destroyed the movement itself. It discredited it because the political actors couldn't help but overreach. They couldn't help themselves in trying to take what, again, was a just cause of bringing people who committed crimes, abused people, harassed people, and intimidated and silenced them into power to justice. Again, a very positive thing. But here, I'll never forget Mazie Hirono going up there and telling men to shut up and sit down. That's a pretty far step from bring legitimately predatory men who've committed crimes to justice to men should shut up, period, full stop. And also that essentially, and this is really kind of the level of justice so-called on campus that exists today, where essentially it's the men are assumed guilty on college campuses. And like, what are the long-term consequences of that? What is it going to mean for the relationships between the sexes going forward? Relatedly, because it sort of falls within this realm, there was an interesting piece over at Barry Weiss's Substack on the sugar babies of Stanford. And I think it tells you how far the pendulum has swung. And you have to ask whether, again, the costs outweigh the benefits. But on the narrow aspect of bringing horrible people to justice, victory. But to Rachel's point, I think well said, the movement ate itself. Political actors couldn't help but try to exploit it. And, the traditional roles of the sexes have been so scrambled. I guess you could say the feminist movement was so successful in so far transcending its initial aims that now you have a society where everything has sort of been turned on its head in terms of the relationships between the sexes. And I can only imagine how that's ultimately going to play out. Maybe it'll lead to, again, the pendulum swinging back when we see the ultimate consequences of this for individuals, for families, for children going forward. That far transcends that more narrow issue of Me Too. I think it is interesting to Josh's point that race seems to have had a longer lasting impact than sex in terms of the culture wars that have followed from these various movements. The last thing I'll say is one other success, in my view, they would perceive it as a failure probably, in terms of like Me Too transitioning then to Women's March, is that it illustrated, it exposed the anti-Semitism, the Jew hatred latent in many of these progressive causes. So for the Women's March part of it, for exposing that, I credit them, I guess. Thank you for exposing what's at the rotten core of progressivism.
All right, so let's transition to a topic that really bears no relation whatsoever to our previous topics. I'm not even going to pretend to make some sort of kind of slick producer-inspired transition here. So I want to talk about Ukraine. And I want to talk about Ukraine because I am just increasingly apoplectic, frankly, like really angry at the global narrative about Ukraine right now, and in particular, kind of what is still the regime, the Biden regime's approach to Ukraine. What is the ruling class's approach, the generals, just kind of all the kind of various bastions and edifices of elite opinion at this point. So to kind of set the table here, so we are over 7 months in to the latest kind of bout of contretemps between Russia and Ukraine. What I have said since day one of this conflict, I have literally, I think, I think on the record, I've been very consistent on this. The U.S.'s interest in this conflict is as between the two options of Zelensky, who was remarkably flawed, but as between Zelensky and the alternative, which is a Putin-installed Belarus-style Lukashenko puppet in Kiev. We prefer Zelensky. Beyond that, as far as kind of the extreme regions of eastern Ukraine, Luhansk, Donetsk, Crimea, the Donbass, I'm sorry to say, but there is simply no vested American national security interest in the particular outcome there. First of all, it is very debatable as kind of like a matter of Eastern European, Slavic kind of world history, whether some of these particular regions, villages, towns on a town-by-town basis, it is very debatable whether some of them are best viewed as Ukrainian, Russian. A lot of them have large ethnic Russian populations there. And it's just simply not even remotely obvious that the U.S. has a compelling national interest, compelling kind of security interest in which country, in kind of the abstract, on a blank slate, these particular towns would choose to be with, whether it's the blue and yellow flag or the red, white, and blue flag of Russia. But nonetheless, I mean, for months and months now, the U.S. has just continued to kind of give off, tens and tens of billions of dollars of aid, military equipment. And we've gone to the point now where Putin has staged what appear to be kind of sham referenda in a bunch of these villages. And to me, what it appears Putin is trying to do here is try to kind of declare victory, or at least save face. The Russian economy has obviously been hit quite a bit by this, although the ruble, the currency, actually has been doing quite good, which kind of shows the idiocy of the Western sanctions in many respects there. So it seems to me like, with these sham referenda in these towns, Putin is possibly trying to kind of get an off-ramp for this conflict. If only the West would take him up on this. I mean, Henry Kissinger has been saying this for months, going back to late May, early June. I think he was actually, I think he was at the World Economic Forum, if I remember correctly, when Kissinger basically said, it's time to come to the negotiating table, return to the 2014 status quo ante. Crimea, by the way, obviously has been kind of disputed for at least 8 years, going to 2014. But, the reason I want to talk about this most dramatically is because on Monday, Elon Musk tweeted this. Elon Musk tweeted, I'm just reading from my phone here, Ukraine-Russia peace. So he's proposing the peace terms here. Redo elections of annexed regions under UN supervision. Russia leaves if that is the will of the people. Crimea, formerly part of Russia, as it has been since 1783 until Khrushchev's mistake. Water supply to Crimea assured. Ukraine remains neutral. So the Ukraine remains neutral thing is really referring to NATO, right? But nonetheless, the Biden administration is talking about possibly trying to fast track ascension to NATO for Ukraine. And it's just going to be the same damn thing playing all over again. So I am just so fed up with this point. From my perspective at this point, every single idiot who kind of gets up there with the Ukraine lapel pin, talking about how it's the U.S.'s position to take back every single inch of disputed territory. It's the last Ukrainian we will send off. God knows how many U.S. taxpayer dollars to achieve and secure that end. Because Putin is Hitler, it's Neville Chamberlain, it's Munich. I mean, guys, get a freaking grip. Just get a grip. I mean, the Eastern European Slavic politics is messy stuff. And at this point, the U.S. interest is peace. It is de-escalation, détente, and peace. It is not arming Ukraine to the last man to take back every single depot or community center in the freaking Donbass. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but I am just really peeved at the fact that this storyline just will not go away, and that our leaders apparently have no particular interest in seeing it go away.
I think the Kissinger point about the off-ramp is key here because, you know, traditionally this is how we've dealt with autocrats, so going back all the way to the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? They have to thump their chest in public, they have to talk big, but at the end of the day, the goal here is to avoid a nuclear escalation, period, full stop. And we don't seem to be interested in pursuing that. It was Dan Gore had an interesting piece in the National Interest yesterday where he even said, look, like the Russian playbook, Putin's been very clear, if he feels his state is existentially threatened, their playbook says they will use nuclear weapons. On the other hand, anyone who has been doing high-level NATO war games suggests that even if Putin attacks with nuclear weapons, NATO will not respond in kind. So, like, what are we doing here? Like, what are we actually doing? And what is the end game here? That's what's always been unclear to me, specifically because for all the talk about Russia being this sort of existential threat to the West, I am not completely convinced that Russia, outside of the sort of territorial disputes on its border, has the ability to go beyond that. Not to say that people in Ukraine aren't suffering, not to say all these, you know, things aren't worth talking about, but at the end of the day, Russia is a dying petrostate, right? It cannot have territorial ambitions that large. China, on the other hand, is a completely different question, and one where we should be having, you know, these kind of conversations, because that is a country that we could end up in an escalation like this with drastic results. So I've always wondered why the Russia question is sucking all the action out of the room. Not to say it's not a threat to Europe, but Europe needs to be engaging much more, I think, than we are at this point.
Well, and similarly, if we were in a situation where China were like the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War, in a position to create this massive swath of the Earth's land, Russia, as a satellite state, then yeah, maybe there's reason to sort of be pushing this hard over the Donbass, which again I understand, an invasion of a sovereign country, the suffering that has come as a result of this war. I mean, it's unconscionable. There's no justification for it. But this is not a situation where we have a lot of really good evidence that Russia is cooperating with China. We absolutely know that. They're friendly with China, but it doesn't seem to be the case that China's turning this huge chunk of land into a satellite state where we should be, you know, super concerned about or have the same type of security concerns about an incursion into the rest of the European continent by this sort of first domino, by thinking of the Donbass as the first domino. So I think Josh is pointing to what Kissinger has said is kind of interesting, especially coming from Kissinger, and it's a good kind of, I think, indication of where a lot of, you know, at the moment, more sober-minded people who have some distance from the situation, even people like that see. I mean, it's like Kissinger and Chomsky are on the same page. I don't know.
So, you know, this is obviously a complex situation, and that you have all of these competing actors within nations and then collectively, each with their own angles here, and their perceptions of the other powers that they're dealing with obviously govern what their own responses are. I think that at a high level, the important thing to note is that there doesn't seem to be any appetite, despite what you would view as probably the successes of the Ukraine, buttressed by the full power of the Western world, essentially, against Russia. There doesn't seem to be any desire to get to a de-escalation and a strategic negotiation between the parties. Why is that the case on our side? It's dumbfounding. It's costing us, to the extent that we've massively drained our strategic petroleum reserve. We're obviously funding to the tune of tens of billions of dollars Ukraine, and there doesn't seem to be any end in sight to those dollars that we're committing. We've been draining our own weapons stockpiles to supply them, of course, are involved on the intelligence side of things. And then you have actually mobilizations, basic mobilizations at low levels of Russia's nuclear forces in recent days, various aspects of it. There doesn't seem to be any desire on the part of the West to say, let's get to the negotiating table right now. You can save face, Vladimir Putin, however you'd like to save face. But we ought to return to something of a ceasefire here and a cessation of tensions. Instead, the rhetoric seems to be infinitely more heated. So the rhetoric and the action combined lead to a literally combustible situation. You saw U.S. officials talking sort of with glee about the destruction in the Nord Stream pipelines that we talked about last week. And that may well be a good thing long term. Obviously, you don't want to have levers of power for Russia to have over Europe in terms of turning the oil spigot literally on or off and letting people freeze or not. It'd be great if Europe diversified its energy sources. It'd be great if they bought our oil, liquefied natural gas as well. But there's a question of at what cost and where does this ultimately end? And to the last point, yes, this is a huge diversion from Russia's senior partner in the senior-junior relationship with Communist China. Communist China gets to see how we operate in this situation, which may or may not prove a template for Taiwan. But meanwhile, we continue to draw down our resources and potentially end up embroiled in a far greater conflict here. And you wonder, when are cooler heads going to prevail? And I don't see it right now. And so you have to ask the question, cui bono at the end of the day? Who benefits from this? And it is worth noting, you already have people on the Western side talking about a rebuilding effort in Ukraine. And that is going to be a massive grift ultimately. So this is just disastrous all around. It'd be great if cooler heads would prevail and we would get to a negotiating table now that Putin really has been repelled.
Well, on that note, we can move into final thoughts, and I can kick it off. I want to come back to actually final thought I had on my segment, which I think goes to this broader discussion of elites screwing up the country and again and again and again, right? And it goes to something Ben mentioned about, the most we know about EcoHealth Alliance and what will be done about it and what will be done about Anthony Fauci boils down to sort of these made for YouTube moments of oversight at congressional hearings. And I think this really speaks to the burden that's on congressional Republicans should they take any kind of majority in the House or the Senate. They've indicated that oversight will be a key part of their agenda, and that's fine. I'm all for oversight, but at the end of the day, what are you going to do about it? And I've made this point in several other contexts, probably too on this podcast, that the January 6th Select Committee opened up a wide, cavernous amount of precedents that can be used by House Republicans. They are using Congress to punish people. And, this is a point that I made in my NatCon speech. Conservatives have to be willing to bring that fight to the Democrats, not out of this partisan retaliation, but out of survival, right? You see people blatantly willing to call for social media, censorship, call for their opponents to be taken offline, denied access to public life, jailed, or otherwise comfortable enough to give again federal money to the people that started the COVID-19 pandemic and not care who notices because they know they will never be punished. And so I think there has to be this next step among congressional and the political right in particular to say, okay, it's not just we're going to thump our chests at you at a hearing. We are going to use the precedent set by Democrats to really do a full investigation and say, this is not acceptable behavior. People will be fired. People will be held accountable. Funding will be withheld. Whatever they have to do, there has to be some accountability for what people have suffered from these incredibly flawed decisions. People have to be subject to the consequences of their actions. Otherwise, this is never going to stop. And again, people aren't going to put up with it. And that's the dangerous part of this moment. You keep beating people and you keep pushing them into a corner. At some point, they're going to hit you back. And that's a natural human reaction. That is not a sustainable form of self-government. So this is something that I think, you hate to put the burden on these guys, but they've got to do it. This is a moment, for such a time as this kind of thing, that they have to stand up and act.
So I guess I'll just very briefly touch on the other topic that I was thinking of doing my segment on this week, which is this is the start of the Supreme Court term. So the Supreme Court started its 2022, 2023. I can't even keep track of the years at this point. They started their new term on Monday. There are a bunch of high profile cases, maybe not quite. I mean, the slate of blockbuster cases the last term saw, that was really kind of like a once a decade, once a generation term, as we've discussed ad infinitum on this podcast. But, there are at least three other, there are more, but there were three other kind of, from my perspective, marquee kind of first rate issues that come immediately to mind. The first are the 2 affirmative action cases. So this is out of Harvard and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. So you get kind of both the private and the public school there. The question, which the court most recently directly confronted in the Fisher case out of Texas, but most recently kind of upheld the constitutionality of explicitly in the Grutter case of 2003. The questions there is whether race-based criteria in university admissions process is compatible with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. There is also a major free speech case. It's being tried as a free speech case, not a religious liberty case, out of the state of Colorado. So this is the 303 Creative LLC case. So it's kind of a very similar paradigm to a lot of this similar kind of religious liberty litigation. It's not quite a bake the damn cake bigot case. It's in this case, the plaintiff is a Christian woman who has a website design site. Same-sex couple wants to kind of use her services to design the wedding. You know how this goes. So the 10th Circuit, the lower court there, ruled 2-1 against her, but there was a really, really, really compelling dissent by Timothy Timkovich, who's probably the best judge on the 10th Circuit. I do predict that dissent will actually become prescient and will ultimately be vindicated as the law of the land, as they say. It makes very little sense to me why the Supreme Court would grant cert in that particular case if they didn't actually plan to make a definitive ruling. Because in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, a somewhat similar case also out of Colorado 4 years ago now, 4.5 years ago, they had a very narrow ruling, kind of minuscule procedural grounds that kind of kicked the can down the road. So the mere fact that they kind of granted cert here leads me to believe that they're prepared to make a slightly more definitive ruling. Then the final case is the Voting Rights Act case out of Alabama. The particular details of that case are maybe a little too arcane for this lawsuit, but it involves kind of racial gerrymandering. And I guess kind of combining that case with the affirmative action cases, it seems to me that the court this term has a golden opportunity to, and dare I say, if I can muster a modicum of rare judicial optimism, I think seems quite possibly poised to actually rule in decisive kind of colorblind fashion in both the Voting Rights Act case and the affirmative action cases, and basically tries to get race as far out of our law as possible. And the very idea of getting race so far out of our law as possible, whether it's in gerrymandering, the Voting Rights Act context, or in the affirmative action context, or anything else, the idea of getting race out of politics and law is quite countercultural these days, right? Because the progressive left, the wokeratis, the Kendi, CRT crowd, they want race to imbue everything we do. So if the court can actually kind of stand its ground in those cases in particular and try to kind of read color blindness into the Voting Rights Act and gerrymandering, as well as just once and for all end the systemic racism of affirmative action, they would be really, really, really doing a solid, and I think really, really, really stopping the ascension of this deeply insidious race-centric woke ideology as well.
I'll just say really briefly, before we started taping, we learned sadly that Loretta Lynn had died at the age of 90 years old, one of the greatest poets, one of the greatest American artists that the country has ever seen. And it's sad, but she lived a very long and a really incredible life. And she's well known, I think, in sort of the in cultural circles, in art circles, for the pill, which a lot of progressives really like to talk about. She had a very popular song that was, questionable at country radio at the time, which was a very big deal because country radio used to be and still is the gatekeepers, and more than other genres at least. And the lyrics for the pill are really interesting. I have them up on the screen here. And I think they're really interesting in light of the Me Too conversation that we had earlier. She says, "You wined me and dined me when I was your girl, promised if I'd be your wife, you'd show me the world. But all I've seen of this old world is a bed and a doctor bill. I'm tearing down your breeder house because now I've got the pill." And it's a very, very interesting perspective on the pill at a time when I think people are suddenly starting to question the acceptance of a lot of these quick technologies that changed things really fast. But I think it's worth for people who are involved in that discussion, as I often talk about those things, to remember that nobody wants to roll back the clock right to 1950, that there have been, and especially for women of less privilege, and women in lower income communities with less social capital and less resources. There have been a lot of, I'm not talking about the pill specifically, but there have been changes in domestic violence. There have been changes in family formation. There have been big changes that have happened really quickly, but some of them have been for the good. And I think, it's always worth remembering that. And I look forward to a lot of the remembrances of Loretta Lynn as this week goes on.
So I just want to return briefly to the whole concept of quote unquote gender affirming care and just point out that it's so striking how devoted the left is to this cause. And that's from the DOJ, which, by the way, has already put out directives in the past saying that it would protect gender affirming care efforts, so-called, within the states. You have teachers who are being directed by their various educational authorities to essentially advise kids to consider transitioning behind their parents' back. And then you have these medical associations as well now in on the act. It's just striking how devoted they are to this cause. And you have to ask yourself why this particular issue. And I think there are a couple aspects of it worth pondering. One is that this creates a wedge between children and their parents. And the progressive left has always sought to break down those bonds because it aids them in their revolution and increases the powers of the institutions that seek to indoctrinate them. Another aspect is that this is about essentially transcending or shrugging off our literal nature. Also, I think, perfectly reflective of the progressive cause, which essentially puts man in the place of God and essentially says that the natural world as it is, you can transcend that. You can do whatever you want. You are all powerful as a being, and you should even deny your own basic biology as a consequence of it. And then the last part of it, of course, using the power of the police to try to impose this on people. I think it shows you that there's nothing is sacred. There is no boundary they will not cross. There is no power they will not use in service of their revolution. And so once again, that leads to the question for us of what do we do about it? How do you respond when your political opponent is willing to do anything to dominate? That's the question we try to answer, or at least explore every single week here. And I think it's the critical question and the critical one to answer, because that is the meta narrative that transcends pretty much every conversation we're having here.
Well, I think on that note, we had everything from Loretta Lynn to gender affirming care to nuclear weapons, because we have it all, folks. So, so on behalf of Emily, Ben, and Josh, I am Rachel Bovard, and we will see you on the next NatCon Squad.